Hi everyone, welcome to the inaugural series or seminar in the campus's new series on responsible conduct of research. As you can see, there's an enthusiastic demand for this type of training on campus. So before next week's session, could you please make sure to visit the website to see if there's going to be a room change. We may have it here, we may have it in another location, just so that we can accommodate all the people who want to come. And also make sure that you sign in sheet on either side, because if you attend 8 of our 12 seminars, you will receive a certificate of completion, and this can be used to fulfill your NIH requirement if you're attending for those purposes. I'm Erica Whitney. I'm the organizer of the seminar series. If you ever have any questions, you can contact me through the website. That's listed up on the board as well, and you can see our upcoming topics. So next week, Bob Price, the Associate Vice Chancellor of Research, is going to be speaking on research misconduct. And today we have Jill Baldwin with us. She's the Associate Director of Sponsored Projects Office and the Research Conflict of Interest Coordinator for the campus. She's a Cal grad, both undergrad and graduate school, and she has over 20 years of experience dealing with this topic.
Or some variation of
it. So if you could save your questions to the end so we can have a Q&A session, and we're recording this. You guys won't be on. It's okay. Just the two of us will be on the recording. But we want to be able to record your questions so that we can save them for people who weren't able to attend today.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Can I just get a, how many postdocs do we have in the room? Graduate students? Staff? Faculty? Okay, that helps. Okay, so this is, what I wanted to do was talk about research conflict of interest and touch on the policies of the campus, the policies of the funding agencies, and also just kind of navigating through the system at Berkeley, because it gets complicated. And it's bureaucratic in some ways. We have control over very little of that bureaucracy, unfortunately. We have control over very little of the information that we have to collect. So anyway, here we go. So some very basic thing, what is a financial interest? So anything of economic value, including a fiduciary relationship with an outside entity, whether that outside entity is for-profit or non-profit, doesn't apply to government entities, either US government, state government, foreign government. It also doesn't apply usually to other educational institutions when we're talking about financial conflict of interest in research. And while not an exhaustive list, let me go back a little. While not an exhaustive list, some examples of financial interest could include positions, whether they're paid or unpaid, such as a director, a founder, a consultant with a for-profit or a nonprofit. It includes membership on a scientific or technical advisory board, consulting income, stock or stock options, honoraria, loans, gifts, and I'm not talking about research gifts that are given to the regions, but individual gifts to the individual, travel payments in some cases. It may include royalties you receive on inventions that are exist not through UC Berkeley or not through UC. And the definition extends to spouse, registered domestic partner for the state of California, as well as dependent children. So what is a conflict of interest? So that was financial interest. Conflict of interest, so in very broad terms, you can see what that is. And this is real or perceived, paid or unpaid, where a financial interest, as previously defined, of an investigator or obligations, financial obligations, have or may have the potential to bias a research project. So bias the outcome of a research project, bias the results of a research project. And an example of that would be, say, a UCB faculty member holds stock in the XYZ Corporation, chairs the board, scientific advisory board, or is on the board, which decides how a company's research dollars may be spent. Potentially, that could be a conflict of interest. How about a financial conflict of interest in research? Drill down a little bit further. This can be a little bit more nebulous, so much depends on the science, but where in research is a situation where an objective layperson, so a fairly well-educated but not necessarily well-educated layperson, might perceive that an investigator's financial relationships could bias the research work that's being done. So, assuming all of the previous conditions apply, say an investigator has a financial conflict of interest if he's a consultant to a company that is also sponsoring research in his laboratory, and the consulting that he's doing is in the same area as the campus research activity. Another example is a faculty member who owns significant equity in a company whose product he or she wants to use in a research project in the campus lab. Another example is an investigator wants to make a subaward to an entity from a research project that is being administered by the campus, and they have a financial relationship with that entity as well. But the big question is a financial interest automatically a conflict of interest? And the answer is no, it is not. The important thing to remember is that the disclosure of the financial interests and the vetting of those interests by an institutional committee, in this case it's a faculty conflict of interest committee, and having them decide whether that interest relates to the research, could be affected by the research, or whether the research could affect a financial interest, and then having a way to mitigate the conflict is the important thing. So disclosure is the all important thing, and that is so elimination, reduction, or management of the conflict can be done so that the research can still take place, so that the financial relationships that the individuals have can be maintained, but that the public, and that's our, you don't see it on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, there's transparency, the buzzword from the government, but it's transparency, so that everything is clear, and there isn't any possibility in most people's minds of anything being truly conflicting. So everything can happen together. There are many institutions, especially medical schools, medical centers, where there is, where they say any financial interest in an outside entity, if they're providing funding to your laboratory, would be considered a financial conflict of interest and would not be allowed. That doesn't happen here. We don't have any absolute prohibitions. The Financial Conflict of Interest Committee here looks at all of the circumstances, looks at the individual research project, looks at the totality of the activity that's taking place. Often we'll look at the number of partners that are participating in a particular research project. So there are big center grants where, 10 companies are all providing lots of funding. And the principal investigator may have a financial relationship with one of those companies. But because there are 10 companies and the playing field is pretty level, is that a significant financial conflict? Maybe not. Depends on what the relationship is with that entity and how it's related specifically to the research that's being done. Many institutions also have a zero threshold for financial interests when we're talking about clinical trials. There are a few clinical trials that go on at Berkeley. There are a number of research projects which are associated with clinical trials that will be being done elsewhere, but there still is not a prohibition here on financial interest if there's a clinical trial. There are many institutions that require that any consulting that an investigator does during the period of performance of a research project not happen if they also have a financial interest with the entity providing the funding for the research project. That also doesn't happen here. There may be circumstances where it might have to happen, but I've been doing this for a long time, and I can name 2 times when the decision by the Conflict of Interest Committee was you can't consult with this company for the life of the research project. And that's draconian for this committee. It just doesn't normally happen. So it's important to note several points then with regard to the Berkeley COI committee and the way they review things. Financial interest does not automatically doom a research project. It's the action of disclosure to an appropriate body for review and mitigation that's the key. If any of you have done federal work, you know that the Bayh-Dole Act, the federal regulation that requires us to manage our inventions that are funded by, it's not working. Okay. I don't care. Technology. Okay. So the Bayh-Dole Act actually sets up conflicts of interest, if you think about it, or potential conflicts of interest, if you think about it. We're charged by the federal government with managing and commercializing and, exploiting the intellectual property that is developed with federal funding by the university. What's one of the best ways to do that? Faculty startups, any number of things like that. So if you're in a situation where you're trying to manage federal IP, the Office of Technology Licensing here has helped you with a startup. You don't have a lot of venture capital yet. You're getting there, but you don't have it yet. What do? Of course you have to be involved in the company to make it go. Of course, the research that's being done on the campus is of vital interest to the company to get things going. So there are some inherent conflicts, but the key is to be able to manage them, and mitigate them. So let's go on to the next. This is just a summarization of what I just told you there. And again, reduced, manage, or eliminated. Usually here it's reduce or manage. There are often conflicts that just simply can't be eliminated. By definition, they can't be eliminated. So the key is to reduce or manage them. This is just and if any of you have laptops, this is the Conflict of Interest Committee website. There's a lot of information on here. We update it regularly. All of the current disclosure forms that you need to use are on there. It has links to the federal, state, university, and campus implementation, guidance, guidelines, forms, everything is there. So there are 3 different types of financial disclosures that are required on this campus depending on the type of work you're doing. There's the state of California, which has one set of conflict of interest disclosure requirements. In that case, the relationship that's being disclosed is one that's direct between the principal or principals, and generally that's the principal investigator, the co-principal investigator, between the principals and the entity providing funding to the lab, whether that's through a gift or a grant or a contract. So it's a direct one-to-one relationship between that individual and the funding entity. That's the only thing that needs to be disclosed. Under the federal regulations, and I'll talk a little bit more about the new federal regulations that were just issued 3 weeks ago. Under the federal regulations, currently just PHS, which is basically NIH and NSF, anyone who meets the federal definition of investigator has to disclose. So that's anyone who is responsible for design, conduct, or reporting of a project. That's a really broad definition. We had an NSF site visit a few years ago, and they questioned whether graduate students were ever filing conflict of interest disclosures. And we said, well, sometimes they do. They said if a graduate student, in NIH's view, if a graduate student was in the lab alone for some period of time, running experiments or directing others, that would qualify them as an investigator and they should file conflict of interest disclosures. So you have it. For human subjects, there is also a financial conflict of interest disclosure. And if any of you have worked with e-protocol, there are 3 questions about financial interest that have to be answered. If any one of those questions is answered yes, then there's a disclosure form that needs to be filled out. For human subjects, any member of the research team working under that protocol has to complete a financial disclosure if any of those questions are answered yes. That form is a mess. I hate it. It doesn't work very well, but it's currently being revised, so hopefully it'll get better. Here's just some screenshots for you from the Conflict of Interest Committee. So the state of California has required financial disclosure since the mid-'80s. and this is for receipt of gifts, grants, cooperative agreements, whatever, from non-governmental sponsors. The state of California does exempt quite a number of non-governmental sponsors. So if you go to the website, the conflict of interest website, you'll see those sponsors where you don't have to complete conflict of interest disclosures. And then in 1995, NIH and NSF instituted federal disclosure requirements for all investigators, and as I described. And since then, a number of nonprofit sponsors and other federal sponsors in certain circumstances have also adopted the federal regulations. A note about DOE, while Department of Energy as an agency, when you're receiving external funding from them to the campus, not when you're a joint appointee at LBL, but when you're receiving external funding, for certain programs, DOE also has a financial disclosure requirement. We've found a way to work around that. I shouldn't say that, sounds negative or sounds manipulative. We found a way to handle the DOE disclosure requirements, and usually that can be done by sponsored projects with some questions to the investigator and the PI involved. All of the regulations require, I'm going to just go through some more screenshots just so you can see what it looks like. There's a policy and review section, there's a forms section, the website's divided into state, federal, and human subjects, as well as UC, so you can, all the most current forms are on there every time as well. So a couple more comments. If any of you are familiar with the UC Discovery program, they get a little more complicated. There are some UC programs where both the federal and the state regulations apply. And the reason for that is these programs have industry partners. So for the investigator themselves, they're following the federal regulations. But because there's an industry partner and the federal regulations won't necessarily capture the kinds of information they want, they also use the state regulations. And if you have human subjects on one of those things, you would also have a human subjects regulation to follow. Ideally, these will all be collapsible into one at some point, but right now we do have 3 very distinct sets of regulations that we have to deal with. So, and we have some influence over the state of California and how financial disclosures are done, but unfortunately not as much as we'd like. And the state regulates the form that you fill out, the 700U. I think some of you have probably seen that form. And so we have little ability to change some of the state requirements right now. We're working on it. I think most people in this room would be more involved with federal financial disclosures and human subjects financial disclosures, federal especially, because of the definition that applies to those working on federal projects. So what has the Conflict of Interest Committee recommended in some typical cases on the campus? Case number 1 is kind of related to the original comment I made, where the financial interest is relatively modest. That could be holding some common stock. If the financial interest is a small amount of income or travel reimbursement, if it's honoraria, typically under $2,000 or so for one-time consulting in an area, this has to be, it has to be unrelated and demonstrably unrelated by written confirmation on the disclosure. Only tangentially related to the research project in question. In a case like this, the committee may simply recommend acceptance of an award or a gift without any stipulation, no conditions at all. If the investigator also sits on the scientific advisory board of a nonprofit, the committee usually determines there's nothing significant about that, so it doesn't need to be mentioned. What about the same situation as number 1, but the investigator has an ongoing consulting relationship with the sponsor or holds fairly significant equity in the sponsor? In that case, if the investigator anticipates this consulting relationship to be ongoing during the period of the research project, then in addition to reviewing the consulting agreement that the investigator has with the company and that's something that is submitted with the disclosure. It's reviewed by the Conflict of Interest Committee, by no one else. It's not kept, it's shredded immediately after the meeting. So it's a copy of the consulting agreement or a very detailed description with the disclosure. The committee may look at that. They'll take the situation in hand. They'll look at the science that's being proposed, and then they may require that disclosure of the financial relationship be made in publications or presentations. And then I check that I'll periodically go to PubMed or somewhere, and I'll look to see if the appropriate disclosure has been made. And that's usually something as simple as, Dr. X discloses that they have a financial relationship with company Y. It's not detailed, but it's a statement that's made. Third case. So again, all three of the previous things happen, but in this case, an investigator has ownership, significant ownership, or in a company, or managerial responsibilities with the company, and that company will sponsor research in the lab. We have many situations here where the faculty member or the postdoc or even the graduate students in a number of cases, more frequent cases, is the founder of a company, or all three together. That's not unusual at all. And in cases where they're startups, the founders are also definitely involved in whatever commercial direction the company's going to take. Otherwise, why would you start a company? So the committee looks at all the facts surrounding those cases, the extent of the equity in the company, the specific roles in the company. Is the investigator who's filing a disclosure directing the research agenda, or is somebody else taking that on? Has any management of the company been transferred to a separate independent management team? Is there a CEO that's been hired that isn't an academic? How is the spouse involved? We have many situations where we've got companies that are started by a faculty member and their spouse is a CEO. What do you do in situations like that? Those things exist. They have to be managed. Is the company a real raw startup? How much venture capital has been secured? When and how does the investigator serve as a consultant to the company? And very important, how closely does the specific research project in the lab that's being funded overlap with the immediate commercial interests of the company? So it's often possible to have all these things happen, but then to detail in a financial disclosure that the immediate commercial interest of the company may not have immediate commercial interest. They may be just interested in VC, raising VC, so there aren't any immediate commercial interests. If these things can be teased apart, and the faculty who are on the Conflict of Interest Committee do that very well, because they represent all scientific disciplines too, and we bring in people. If they think we can't do this, we need to talk to somebody else, or bring in another faculty member who would have experience in that area. If you can tease all these things apart and put fairly bright lines between activities and responsibilities, and if you can make scientific bright lines or fairly bright lines between activities, then that's a management plan. So that doesn't doom a research project. That's a way to manage whatever's happening in the lab. When the distinction is less clear, in this case, mostly the committee it would be disclosure. It may be a more detailed disclosure in publications and presentations. When the distinction is less clear, then there's also usually a requirement for the investigator to disclose to anybody in the lab their interest in this company. And we've had it where both a principal investigator and a graduate student had to disclose their interest in a company. Postdocs, it's often the case too. You disclose your interest in a company if you have it. And then also in papers and presentations. The thing that the committee is really concerned about in all of these cases, and the more complicated they are, the greater the concern, is protecting graduate students. And that is making sure that graduate students aren't unduly influenced by a financial relationship to have their research being directed somewhere where they don't necessarily want to go. So a typical management plan is to have the chair of the department that the investigator is in, appoint an ad hoc committee to meet annually with the graduate students so they can be assured that they're moving toward matriculation. They don't feel undue pressure, and just to basically check in with them and make sure everything's going okay. And most faculty, in fact, I don't think I've had a faculty member who has resisted this. Most faculty members are really happy to have somebody do that, because it kind of takes the responsibility away from them. It puts it into a fairly disinterested committee, and it allows the students to have a place to vet any concerns. There have been times when they've asked a committee to meet with postdocs for the same reason. But it's generally graduate students, because they have their progress to degree is the most important thing. Then we have case 4, and this was a real one, where a faculty member not only has major equity ownership in a company, but also scientific and fiscal responsibility for the company. The company was proposed as a major subcontractor on a NIH grant. And the only two other employees of the company were the spouse and the child, not a dependent child, but spouse and child of an investigator. So in this case, the founder, who was the faculty member, retained significant control over both the scientific and fiscal management of the company, supervised the only other employee, who was the spouse, and then the committee determined in that case that because the relationships were so close, it wasn't possible to disentangle their corporate responsibilities from their academic responsibilities for the NIH grant, and that each would be seriously compromised because of those entanglements. Research results and activities could be biased in favor of the company because of this critical financial relationship that the couple had. And remember, all of those things from case number 3 still existed as well. And then the committee also decided that the investigator could not reasonably decide on the suitability of the company as a subcontractor, because there was no disinterest, there was no hands length relationship, and then couldn't also supervise and direct the company employees. So in this example, even here, the committee suggested several management possibilities, including industrial leave for the investigator. Decide what's most important right now? Is it getting your company going? Industrial leave is a possibility. Resubmission of the proposal to NIH with another campus faculty member as the PI on the campus, so that the conflict is mitigated, so that the principal investigator would be someone other than the one who was also the director of the company. Was it possible to have another subcontractor? Was it just convenient to have the company subcontract? Well, in this case, it turned out that there was software involved in this that was unique to this small company. So we met with the PI several times individually, said, okay, what can we do? Tell us more about the science, tell us more about the actual activity that's going on in one place or the other, see what we can do. In the end, the investigator determined that none of these were satisfactory, and realized, there's just no way I can't separate these things. There's no way to draw any kind of line. And it was the investigator who decided to withdraw the proposal and wait until the company was further along, and also seek out collaborators so that the conflict could be mitigated by having other people be involved. And, that was a reasonable decision, but it's very rare when it gets to that point, because there's usually the ability to put things into at least semi-independent boxes in order to get a research project going. I just wanted to point out a couple of other things. Recently on campus, some of you have seen these already, we designed new federal disclosure forms and I've given you copies of those. Also, a new 700U addendum. The 700U isn't going to affect too many of you. I know the staff will be interested because they have to make sure the investigators do it properly. The 700U that you see in front of you, I've put that in your packet. That is a state form. We cannot change that form. We can't change the criteria. We can't change the thresholds. That form is mandated by the state of California. It has to have an original inked signature on it. and we have no choice or discretion in the information that's collected. Basically, those are checking yes or no boxes. The addendum that is connected with that, that's where the meat of the information comes. That is a campus form. So that is not, it's used to implement the state regulations, but it's a campus form that allows the Conflict of Interest Committee to get the information they need to make a fully informed decision about any real or perceived conflicts of interest. The federal form is new as well. This is the current the current way we can meet federal requirements. That's going to change right quick here. The federal form is the one that's submitted by anyone who meets the definition of investigator. And again, the information that's in there is so that we can implement the federal regulation and make a fully informed decision. So, a couple of things about this. I say, filling out the 700U. If any of you get exceptional PI status or anything like that, you'll see these things. The questions have to be answered completely. We don't have the option of saying, oh, we know what that should be and fill it in for you. So there are all kinds of things. You know, there are phone numbers required, mail codes required, email required, academic unit required, you know, all of these things, the date of the signature. So these are things that people in a rush to get things done, you know, skip over. And as I said, they have to have original ink signatures, one disclosure per person. We've actually had a case where 3 people tried to sign the same disclosure because they said the answers for everybody were the same. But it's a distinct state obligation, so we had to get 3 separate disclosures. I have to return incomplete or incorrect forms, and I think right now, unfortunately, we're running somewhere between 35 and 40% of the forms come to me with errors or omissions, and it's a real problem. We simply return them. There's a memo that goes back saying exactly what's missing. I have to admit that when it's just a mail code, I have an assistant. I said just write in the mail code. We know what the mail code is. We can look it up. But there are other things that we just simply can't change because of the nature of the form. And the new federal form is in an attempt to streamline the way financial disclosure was gotten on this campus with federal, with NIH particularly, but with NIH and NSF. We redid the federal form so that everyone who is an investigator fills out a form. There are some basic questions that you answer at the beginning. If the answers are no, you sign the form and you move on. If the answers are yes, then there's additional information that needs to be provided. And all of these are also currently on the website. If some of you realized before, this is mostly for the staff. There was this thing called the conflict of interest checklist. That's gone. We don't have a conflict of interest checklist anymore. It's simply a one form for everybody to do the same thing. The addendum and the federal form are all fillable. They're available online. The only form that we need an original wet signature on is that 700U form. Everything else can be electronic form. It can be a fax. It can be whatever. It has to be a real signature, but it doesn't have to be a wet signature. And now just a little bit of information, and then I'm going to stop and take questions. Recently, the NIH updated, it took 2 years, but the final rule for changing the disclosure regulations for the Public Health Service, which is going to be all of your NIH grants, happened 3 weeks ago. And what I've given to you is a 2-sheet thing. This is actually just kind of a cheat sheet, so you can see what the old regulations were and how they've changed. It's truly going to affect the kind of administration and the Conflict of Interest Committee more than anyone else, because you're still providing information at different thresholds. The thresholds have been lowered significantly. They're not as low as the state of California yet, but they're lower. And then it is going to be up to the institution to determine, well, let me back up a minute. all financial interests related to the research are going to have to be disclosed anyway. And then it's going to be up to the institution to determine if any of those financial interests are related to a particular transactional proposal that's being submitted. So any particular NIH proposal that's being submitted. So there's an additional burden there. We probably will be expanding the COI committee to cover more carefully some of the disciplines and subdisciplines. We have fairly good representation from all over the campus, but we probably are going to have to expand the committee to include a few more people. And also, there is a public disclosure required now. It used to be that I notified NIH that there was a financial conflict of interest that had been managed, reduced, or eliminated. Then then NIH decided we needed to give the name of the person who had the financial conflict. So that was fine. We gave the name and said the conflict had been managed, reduced, or eliminated. With the new regulations, you also have to give details about the financial conflict and be more specific about the management plan and how the committee made the determination that the conflict is related to the research of that particular NIH grant. So there's going to be more, a different kind of a review by the faculty committee. It'll have to be more in depth in some cases. The one good thing about this is the way NIH originally proposed this was that all of this information had to be put on a publicly available website. Now we have the option of either putting it on a publicly available website or having it available within 5 days of a request, and we can do that in written form. This is fairly consistent with what we have to do with the state of California now. Which brings me to this point. All of our financial disclosures are public information. Under California law, if you submit a conflict of interest disclosure, it is public information. And we get public records requests for financial disclosure documents on a fairly regular basis. We have a specified period of time in which we have to submit the documents. You can imagine there are people out there who go fishing for any kind of interesting information that they can find, and so financial interests are one of those things that people are always seeking information about. Does anybody have? I think what I would like to do is to open this up to any questions anybody might have. I ran through this quickly. Some of this is in your handouts as well. We have for the new federal regulations, we have until August of 2012 to implement. So we've got a little bit of time, but not a lot. And what we're hoping is that UCOP is going to take the lead on some of this. We have an active conflict of interest coordinators group that's system-wide. So we've been following this legislation for the almost 2 years it's been out, hoping that it would not be as detailed and draconian as it seems to be, but if anybody knows the name Senator Grassley, you'll know that that's not possible. So I'd like to open it up for questions. Any questions at all on the conflict of interest process? I didn't go into the makeup of the committee or the schedule of the committee. This is all available on the website.
You said that not all financial conflict of interest have to be financial. So if a person is unpaid on an advisory committee or something.
Yeah.
So if a PI gets funding from a private foundation and also performs volunteer work for that foundation, is that something they have to report?
They would be reporting if they have a relationship with the foundation. If the foundation were to, say, reimburse their travel expenses or something like that, then yes, it would be reportable. It wouldn't be significant, and it would just be a matter of disclosing. No. There are cases where there is unpaid. For example, if a company or anyone is going to donate a large piece of equipment to a PI's laboratory, and that PI also has some kind of relationship with that company, sitting on the scientific advisory board, it's disclosable under the state regulation. It's probably disclosable under the federal regulation too, depending on the value of the equipment and so on. But the question is whether it's significant. And if it's significant, then there's usually a management plan that has to be put into place. And that could be as simple as disclosing in publications that, you know, this equipment was donated by the XYZ Corporation with whom the investigator also has a financial relationship. There's actually been some research done, and I can, if anybody's really interested in it, it's kind of interesting reading, but research done by folks to determine whether the existence of a disclosure or the lack of a disclosure is the better way to go, and how the public perceives one way or the other. It's especially true in human subjects research. Whether the public perceives a greater conflict because there's been a disclosure made, or whether they are happy that the disclosure's made and so are comfortable that there isn't a conflict. It's an interesting question. Anybody else? Yes?
I was wondering if you could describe a little bit more about how the committee is set up and
Yes.
how people interact with the committee.
Sure.
At what point during your research do you need to disclose a conflict?
The conflicts need to be disclosed at the time a proposal is submitted to any entity for which disclosure is required, or at the time a gift is received from an entity. It's also required if there's any change in the financial relationship during the period of the disclosure. Disclosure period is 12 months. That's simplified, but you're disclosing information. Have you consulted for the company in the last 12 months? Do you intend to consult with them in the next 12 months? It's that kind of thing. And but it is at the beginning. So the disclosure accompanies a proposal to the Sponsored Projects Office or receipt of a gift. And then it's reviewed. The Conflict of Interest Committee is set up by the Vice Chancellor for Research. It meets monthly, and each month there are new agenda items. So what happens ideally is a disclosure is made, the information is sufficient for the committee to make a fully informed decision. It gets put on the agenda and it's reviewed within the month of a proposal having been submitted or a gift having been received. In reality, it can take longer than that if the disclosure information isn't complete enough for a fully informed decision to be made. I think there was a perception. I think hopefully it's being dissipated, but a perception that the Conflict of Interest Committee, and by the way, I hate that name. It shouldn't be called the Conflict of Interest Committee at all. But that the committee was somehow like a policeman. You know, they're delving into people's private business and you know, making judgments like a cop. But actually, what the committee is trying to do is to get the information necessary so that the disclosure is protected, the institution is protected, and the research can go on the way it's proposed without, you know, causing any headlines in the San Francisco Chronicle. And Lord knows there's been plenty of those. So, if you have any questions at all, I know this was fast, and if you have specific questions about your situation or, you know, avoiding a situation, please let me know. The committee is open to meeting with investigators. In fact, we do that a lot. We don't consider these, nothing's cookie cutter in these financial disclosures. I mean, every situation is different. Research projects are all different, so you can't possibly, in our view anyway, apply a cookie cutter to managing conflicts of interest or even potential conflicts of interest. It just doesn't work that way. So the committee is often meeting with individuals. I meet with individuals. We're open. Thank you.